Yeah, thanks for having me on board. I'm really looking forward to sort of sharing some of my insights with all of you. I know a lot of you are graduates as well, so I'm going to give you some advice on how you can explore BIM as a graduate and sort of some things that can prepare you better for the industry. And I'll show you some programs that we use and sort of just run through some things that I'm passionate about, like Dynamo, one of the programs that I use. Yeah, so hopefully it'll be a really good presentation for all of you. And thanks for having me on board
Yeah,
too. I really appreciate the university and BIM Africa having me on board too, and to Ibrahim as well.
yeah, thank you very much. You guys really appreciate Gavin actually 5:15 in Australia right now, so it's so early for him waking up to actually attend this webinar with us. Thank you very much, Gavin.
Oh, you're welcome. That's okay. It's a good excuse to get out of bed in the morning. Cool.
Yeah, thank you. So I hand over to you.
No worries. So I'll probably just share my screen. Just give me 1 second. Cool. So my screen coming through now. You can see the zoom and everything. Just checking my screen's coming through.
Yeah, cool.
Excellent. Cool. All right. I'll just boot up my presentation. So I'll just move the bar so I don't see the presenters. Cool. Okay. So my presentation is mostly focused around how you can prepare yourself as a graduate for BIM in the AEC industry. Not just for graduates though. There'll be some tips here for people already working in the industry as well. And I'll just share my insights on BIM, what it is, why it's valuable. So I'm going to cover it in 4 sections. The first one, I'm just going to talk a little bit about me, just so you know who I am and what I do. I'm going to talk about BIM. So if you don't know what BIM is, that's okay. I'm going to go right from the start and work my way through, talk about what programs we use in the industry and also what standards we follow as well. I'm also just going to talk a little bit about my career journey. So where I started, because I was a graduate too one day. About maybe 10 years ago, I was a master's graduate. I'm also going to talk about the challenges that I faced. Some of the challenges that you won't have, luckily, because the world's improved since I was a graduate, but also some new challenges that you can expect to face. And then just some advice on how you can face those and some career pathway options for you. And then I'll just finish up on quickly talking about what we call visual coding, which is a new programming method that we're using in AEC at the moment. So let's get started. So I'll just start by talking about me and what I do. So I'm from Sydney, Australia, so a little way away, so it's about 5:30 in the morning here, so I'm not quite on the other side of the world, but almost. So this is my city on the right. You might recognise the Sydney Harbour Bridge. It's a great city to live in if you ever get a chance to travel. Highly recommend checking it out. We're really friendly down under, so we're always happy to have other people travel here and just catch up and have a beer once this whole coronavirus has moved. Anyway, about me. So my name is Gavin Crump. I'm originally from a city down south called Adelaide in Australia, around the middle south of Australia, but now living in Sydney. I've moved to Sydney in 2015, mostly to improve my career prospects. I graduated in 2012 with a master's in architecture. So the things I tell you will come from experience as an architect and an architectural BIM manager. So I've been in the industry just over 10 years now. And I've worked predominantly as what we call a BIM manager. So someone that manages the BIM systems and workflows. And I'll sort of talk a little bit about what that is and the other types of roles that relate to BIM. But currently I'm working as a BIM consultant for my own business. So some of you might be familiar with my YouTube channel, which is called the Aussie BIM Guru. You can always contact me at this email below if you've got any questions about BIM or Dynamo or other programs. But essentially, I launched this last March. It's got 150 plus videos, and we've just got over about 5,500 subscribers now, so it's growing pretty fast, which is pretty cool. I've got videos coming out twice a week, typically. I'm going to try to keep up that momentum as long as I can. I cover a lot of topics, but most of them relate to software. So I show demonstrations of how you can use programs like Autodesk Revit, Dynamo, Python scripting. I also touch a little bit on Grasshopper for Rhino 3D, for those that use that program instead. I know that's usually more popular at universities, but I also talk about general BIM management and how you can be a better employee and improve your career prospects. So my goal with the channel is really just to help other people improve their BIM with professional context, because there's a lot of channels out there that aren't managed by people working in the industry yet. So I find there's a little bit of misinformation, and I try to give you a more honest, professional approach. So I've got a whole bunch of playlists. I've got like about 63 videos on Dynamo, 42 on Revit. Just made a series on Python from the ground up. So feel free to check them out if you're looking to learn a little bit about those programs. And yeah, I've got plenty of videos. You'll be able to recognize them by this little symbol, the Aussie BIM Guru logo. I've had the same branding since day one, so pretty easy to spot. Anyway, currently I work in a business called BIM Guru. So similar to Aussie BIM Guru, but a little bit different. So this is my consulting business. I launched it at the start of this year. So a very interesting year to begin business, I'll be honest. Obviously, we're all working remotely now, so that's been really interesting to see. Luckily, I started working from home in January, so it hasn't affected me too much, but it's affected my clients quite a lot. And it's just me working there for now. I'm doing this myself. Which is great. If anyone's thinking of opening a small business and this is something they're passionate about, I highly encourage you to do it. I'm loving it so far. It's a really big change from working in a big company. It has its challenges, but it's really rewarding. So I typically release articles on LinkedIn through my business as well about BIM if you're interested. I will be having a Revit template that will be coming out in a week or two. And for a little while, it's probably going to be free. It might not be free to everyone. You might need to ask me for, a discount or something like that. But I want to make this accessible to students at the very least, because I know that students don't have that much money to throw around at things. So hopefully it'll be free. And if not, at least for students. As well as that, I've got some courses coming up on Teachery. And whilst they won't be free, they will at least be hopefully affordable for people all around the world. And sort of my company tackles a lot of different things with BIM, essentially 5 different things, but I guess one of my focuses is still training and education. So I do still try to take as much time as I can in my day to help other people improve themselves. So this is sort of one of the motives behind my presentation to you today. I also do podcasts. I've just started doing podcasts with people. So if you have a podcast show that deals with architecture or software or technology, feel free to get in touch with me, and chances are I'll be interested in joining your podcast for an episode. So I'm going to talk now about BIM. So what it is. So I think I'll look at what it is, why is it valuable for our industry, what programs do we use, and what standards do we follow. So what is BIM? If you're not aware of it, it's Building Information Modeling. That's what it stands for. But when I talk about BIM, I like to flip it and turn it upside down, and I like to say modeling in order to generate information, to construct, to create and support buildings. Because one of the most important things in BIM is it's actually in the middle. It's the information. A lot of people think BIM is just 3D modeling, and it's not. It's so much more than that. So software in BIM is really important. You can't really do much without it, but BIM is enabled by software. So essentially BIM is really more about process, workflows, and communication. You can be the best 3D modeler in the world, but if you don't know how to communicate to someone your ideas, it's not really worth anything. So I find communication is one of the biggest challenges and one of the most important things to refine as a professional, but also just in the industry in general. If you run a business, you should be a strong communicator. So it's really important to value this even in BIM as well. I like to look at BIM a little bit like a barista making a coffee. The end depends on the means, but it's not about the means. The barista isn't just the coffee he makes. He is the process that makes the coffee. The same as BIM. BIM is the process that generates the outcome. So who can use BIM? The good answer is you all can. Everyone in AEC can have something to do with BIM in some way, as long as they're involved in the process of generating or using a piece of the built environment. You can do something with BIM. So this could be architects, it could be engineers, not just structural or civil, also mechanical, electrical, hydraulic, fire services, all types, geotechnical, surveyors, but also contractors. If you're on a building site, a lot of builders are now using BIM models in order to track the progress of construction and also to solve problems before they become a problem on site. As well as that, if you're a fabricator, having a digital model can save you a lot of time because you no longer have to look at 2D drawings and figure out how it looks in 3D when you go to build it using something like AEC and C Machine. It's much easier to use a model to guide these digital tools that can now manufacture for us. But there's many more people on top of that, including our clients. Really important. So BIM is for building. So some of the key values that you get out of building and BIM is that you can coordinate issues in 3D before they occur on site. Before BIM came along, a lot of problems had to be solved on site in the middle of building. They might not realize a problem was there until they came across it on site whilst they were building exactly at that spot. Obviously, we can't afford this level of risk in our construction. Our buildings are more complicated now. Our services are typically more complex as well, especially in projects like hospitals. So we sometimes can't afford this to impact our program. So BIM really helps us here. As well as that, like I said, you can use BIM for design and manufacture. So now architects and some engineers are getting much more involved with the process of fabrication. So building a model that supports this process, not just designing a building and not worrying about how it goes together. For example, some projects use a lot of modular construction techniques where they'll build things off-site and then crane them in on-site. And a lot of the time the BIM model is crucial to managing this process. As well as this, you can build as-built models. So once a project finishes, the builder typically will give us surveys and tell us what's changed from our record models that we sent for construction. And then we can update them and give them back to our clients. And our clients can use these in various programs in order to achieve facilities management workflows. So very powerful for our clients, but also for us. As well as this, you can also test in 4D. So you can do construction simulations to make sure that things like cranes can fit in the building. And when you turn the crane around, it has room to put all the supplies on the site. You can see an example just in the bottom right here of using a 4D simulation model to spatially test whether a crane will feasibly be able to work on a project. Whereas in the top right, you can see an example, and this is from a project I've worked on, just the level of complexity that we can model and coordinate in BIM. You can see here we had a roof truss system, and all the services had to go through the trusses. And some of these things were quite hard to get through, like really big ducts. So yeah, definitely interesting. As well as this, sounds like there might be someone with their microphone on, just might want to mute. Anyway, I in BIM for information. So elements now have data. They're not just lines on pages anymore. You can see here a duct, for example, I'm interrogating in a program called Revit. And you can see that it's got a system classification, so it knows which mechanical system it belongs to. And now you can analyze every component in that system together. So you no longer have to do really complex calculations on paper. Now the model can actually do a lot of this for us. So there's not as much need for interpretation of elements, which is really time saving for our industry. And it means we make less mistakes typically if things are set up properly. As well as this, we can connect our models to live schedules. So we're no longer maintaining an Excel schedule on the side of an AutoCAD drawing, for example, where there's no connection between the drawing and the Excel, aside from the person that's manually doing everything. So that's a really big time saver. And we can also connect all our data to databases. So we can now put things on the web. We can web host all of our data, so that we're seeing a lot of really new, exciting, powerful apps that are able to leverage our data much more intelligently than anything could ever have been before BIM. And as well as this, we can also apply programming to our data. So we can apply programs like Dynamo and Grasshopper, and even just Python or C# in general, to build apps and scripts that can actually speed up how we work. And I'll cover that near the end of this presentation. M is for modeling. So you can find issues in 3D that you'd miss in a plan or a section. Which is really time saving. And as well as that, one of the great things, which I will show you a little bit later, is that if you update a model in BIM, your drawings update as well, because you're not just seeing a 2D drawing, you're seeing a representation of a 3D model. So when you create a floor plan, you're not drawing that floor plan, you're cutting through your 3D model and then drawing over the top of that. So it's a really powerful way of saving a lot of time in manually updating drawings. For example, in AutoCAD, typically people used to have to manually draw their sections. And then if a floor plan updated, they had to bring their section in, line it up to their floor plan, and draw these lines to check where things needed to be aligned to. So a big waste of time that we no longer have to worry about. You can also render using your model now. So you no longer have to send your model overseas to an outsourcing company to have an affordable 3D render. Now you can use programs such as this one on the right here, which is called Twinmotion, which is a model that I generated, which I'll show you a little bit later, to real-time render your projects. And they're much easier to do now because there's so much data in our models. It's really easy to swap over materials, swap over objects, and essentially create a workflow that supports the process of design as well as just presenting for marketing. As well as that, we can walk clients through these models as well in real time, which is really immersive for our clients, because you've got to remember, in architecture and engineering and construction, a lot of the time the client doesn't understand what we're doing. We might show them a floor plan and they don't know what they're looking at. They don't understand how to read a floor plan, because essentially a floor plan is just a set of instructions. So if they don't know how to follow those instructions on the floor plan, it's not really going to mean anything to them aside from what they can visually see. So this really gives us a lot of power. So modeling, I guess I'll just touch on the programs that I use. So for BIM modeling, I typically use a program called Autodesk Revit. It's one of the major BIM platforms in the industry. As well as this, if I'm doing more complicated 3D form modeling, doing things like modeling with NURBS, which are non-uniform rational B-splines, so 2D curvature, so double curvature surfaces and more complex geometry. Typically, I'll use Rhino 3D. I find that these two programs together can do most things that I need. So this is an example of Revit. I've actually got Revit itself available to show you as an example. So this is a Revit model. So I'm in Revit right now. I can go in 3D. So this is my 3D model. And I can also interrogate elements. I can click on them and I can see their properties. For example, I've got an in situ concrete wall. I can go in its structure and see that I've got concrete that's 200 millimeters thick. And there's more data I can populate if I so choose. This isn't a very data-rich model, but you can see just that there's a lot of fields and parameters that you could populate. You can go far beyond that, obviously. This is just an example. But as well as this, I can also look at things in 2D. So I can go to a 2D drawing, but if I select this wall, for example, see I'm selecting the same wall. So now I'm dealing with a 3D, 2D hybrid environment, which is far more powerful. And I've got a section here, so I can look at elements in section, I can see their cut representations, and I can see I'm no longer drawing these. These things are actually generated in 3D. So far more powerful than anything we had before. And let's say I want to really interrogate an element. Let's say I want to look at this floor in 3D. I can generate a little cutaway and really interrogate, my model and get quite a lot of detail out of it. So BIM's sort of like what you put in is what you get out of it. So the more modeling you do, the more detail you'll get and the more information you can extract from your model. So it's quite an exciting thing that BIM does for us. So that's one example of what I use. But there are other programs too. One of the really popular ones is called ArchiCAD. This is very popular in Europe in particular, run by the Nemetschek group. And I find this is probably the biggest competitor to Revit. And it's a great program. It does BIM really well. There are some things that it does better than Revit. But at the same time, Revit does some things better than ArchiCAD as well. There's quite a polar divide between the user bases for these programs, mainly because the only way to work between them is to use a format called IFC, which doesn't work too well in Revit. So there are some challenges depending on which program you pick. But as well as that, there's other less popular but still used options such as Allplan. And then there's some programs that aren't really BIM programs, but are still used in sort of a way that a BIM model would be used, such as SketchUp, which you might be familiar with if you're a graduate. Quite popular because it's got a free version, and also Vectorworks as well. But really, they're not really BIM platforms. So it's more ArchiCAD versus Revit seems to be the biggest divide, but the two most popular platforms. For computation, which programs do I use? So typically for computational design, if I'm working in Revit, typically I'll be using Dynamo, which comes with Revit. Otherwise, if I'm working in Rhino, which is the main reason I work in Rhino, I'll be using Grasshopper, which is far more powerful at processing geometry, but not as good at processing data typically. And as well as that, there's now a tool that's been built by the people that make Rhino called Rhino Inside. And this actually lets you run Grasshopper within Revit, which is really powerful. So I'll show you an example of that shortly. This is an example of a Dynamo script I built that essentially takes a duct system, and given a hanging support family, if you select one duct in the system, it goes and supports the entire system for you automatically based on some spacing rules, just all by using a script. And when you run it, you can pick new systems and just keep going. So it saves a lot of time if you can write something in a scripted manner. Ladybug, this is a software package called Ladybug for Grasshopper and Rhino that deals with solar analysis and other environmental studies. And this is more the power of Grasshopper. It's very fast at dealing with geometry, very complex geometry. For example, if I ran this study in Dynamo, it would crash. It wouldn't handle it. So you can do some very powerful and very abstract concepts using Grasshopper instead. This is an example of Rhino inside, which I'll probably actually just show you because I have this ready as well as an example. So I'll just boot up Rhino and I'll boot up Grasshopper. So I've got my Rhino model here and I've got my Revit model here. So this is actually some geometry that's been processed into Rhino, and then I'm analyzing this using Grasshopper. So I've got a pretty complex script here. And essentially it's finding how many hours of sunlight every square meter of the Revit model is exposed to based on all the obstructions. So I do have all the Revit elements hiding behind the scenes. But what I can do with this is actually collect this as data. So I can find out how many hours on average each room is receiving per square meter. And I've created a little color scheme that I've applied. And this will technically tell me each room's power. At the moment, every room thinks it's receiving 0. If I run my Rhino inside script, it'll update all these rooms and tell them with a number how much they're receiving. Then my color scheme can tell me graphically how compliant my rooms are. So you can see the power of just combining a few programs and capitalizing on their strength in order to create a workflow that supports something more complicated. I'll probably have to close this program just because it's a little bit heavy when you've got it all set up. So I'll just shut that one down. And it should close down Rhino and Grasshopper. So I definitely recommend looking into that as an option. So there's some other programs out there as well that deal with computation. One that I'm looking into right now is called NodeRED, which deals with web-based operations, so dealing with servers and databases and websites. So this paradigm of visual coding is getting quite popular, and I'll touch on it a little bit later in this presentation. But a lot of professionals are actually learning programming. So this is a really interesting thing that we're seeing in the industry. We're seeing people learning not just Python, but also C#, and some people learning JavaScript to deal with web-based applications. So if you like computer programming and you wish you'd become a computer programmer, the good news for you is you can probably still be a computer programmer in AEC. If you don't like computers, I've probably got some bad news for you in that the AEC industry uses quite a lot of computers. But it's really interesting to see the impact that coding is having on our industry and its efficiency. So I think there's someone with a microphone on. You might want to mute your microphone. Anyway. As well as this, now that I'm talking about programming, I should probably mention a company called DiRoots, because I guess one of the people in our webinar, Adeji, a little BIM celebrity in this one, he's actually working with this company, and they're raising awareness, and they're doing a great job too. They're a BIM consulting company, so we're not really in competition. I think we all just support each other, and they're developing some free tools and workflows for Revit using programming. So really interesting to see what some of these companies have managed to do. As well as this, there's some programs that are proprietary. I'll just make sure hopefully that hasn't muted me. Cool, thank you. So there's some programs such as Testfit and Hyper and ArchiStar. These platforms deal with generating some adaptive models, such as this one here, which is automatically generated by a computer algorithm. So this was made by Testfit, and all the designer had to do was put in some constraints, how many types of apartments they wanted, some basic form outlines, and the algorithm generates the building and the car park for you. So pretty amazing what's possible. As well as that, for coordination, I typically use a program called Navisworks, which works hand in hand with Revit. So this is really important for a process that we call clash detection. which tells us when things in the model are intersecting with other things or they're coming too close to other things. For example, if a duct is clashing with a structural wall. Typically this is a problem because we need to use a penetration, which gets in the way of the structural reinforcement of the wall. So it can be done, but we need to be aware of it. So we can use clash detection to inform us. And this example I was talking about before is actually also an example of clash detection. So we used this model in Navisworks above to detect issues. For example, down below you can see we've identified when there's some ducts and some lights in the ceiling that are clashing. So that obviously you can't have a duct and a light on top of each other. So this forces some coordination to occur between a mechanical and electrical design engineer. So it's a really powerful workflow to be aware of how to use. So I highly recommend people check out these sorts of programs as well. But I guess another popular alternative is Syllabary. This is used typically by ArchiCAD users and some Revit users because it handles the IFC format instead, which is a universal file format generated for the construction industry. It does sound like, you know, the perfect solution that one file can be read by all programs. It's not quite that simple. I'll talk about it a little bit later, but this is a good alternative at least. This is an example of someone using an IFC model in Syllabary. For visualization, I use two programs. So I use one program called Twinmotion, which is a derivative of the Unreal engine. So if anyone's ever played Unreal Tournament, the video game, this is actually now a visualization engine in architecture, which is pretty fun. As well as that, I use a plugin called Enscape for Revit typically, but it's also available for Rhino and SketchUp and some other programs, I think ArchiCAD as well, that lets you render in real time. So it lets you actually take your BIM model, like this one I showed you before, and put it into 3D. I've actually got this one available to show you as well, which is pretty fun. So you might remember this model I was talking about. So I've actually exported this to Twinmotion, and now I'm in my model. We can see that I can fly around my model. So it's like you're in a video game, right? It's pretty cool. And you can see the graphic quality it's pretty decent. And you can have a lot of fun in these programs too. I mean, you can find this little guy and you can make him dance. So you can have a lot of fun with these programs. And there's a lot of really quick things you can do to these models once you've set them up. So if you're showing this to a client and they say, oh, like I'm in a snowy region, I want to see what this looks like in winter. I can really quickly just put myself in winter and you can see it starts snowing and everything gets covered in snow. You know, my trees update. So there's some really interesting features and tools that are coming out like this to support what we do. This program for a while was actually free as well, so which was pretty amazing. I don't believe it's free anymore, but if anyone got hold of it before then congratulations, it's a great program. So yeah, really interesting. You see even the cars are driving around, so pretty fun. I'll just close this one too because that uses a bit of memory on my computer. So we'll just jump back in. So that was Twinmotion. But there's some other alternatives out there. So some people just use Unreal Engine as it comes. They don't bother using Twinmotion, which is harder, but it gives you more power. It's essentially like designing a video game. As well as that, Unity is becoming really popular. This is a gaming platform essentially that lets you build video games. It was actually used to build a really popular mobile game called Hearthstone, if anyone knows that one. But it's come into AEC now as well. And also Cinema 4D is quite popular. This is an example of Unreal Editor and sort of the complexity of the program compared to the one I just showed you. But obviously with complexity comes more features. But there's so many more programs to choose from. I've just shown you probably some of the most popular ones, but there's more programs being made every day. So I guess the question comes, what is the right program to use? We obviously only have so many hours in our day. We can't learn every single program. Well, we could, but we'd probably have nothing else to do. So I think it's really important to focus on a few things. Pick a program that firstly you need. Don't just learn a program for the heck of it. If you know you're never going to use a program, say like don't go and use like say SketchUp for BIM if you know it can't do BIM, for example. But if you know you can do things with it, then sure, learn it because you might need it. Maybe your business is going to use this program. At the same time, you have to enjoy it. I find too many people use BIM software but hate using BIM software. If you don't like using the program, then don't use it unless your company forces you to use it, and then find another company to work for that uses the programs you like. I think that's really important. You have to like what you do and you have to be interested in it too. I think if you're not interested in using a program, then again, like, don't use it, or find ways to work with people using the program but doing what you enjoy. So if you're going to be an architect and you don't want to model in BIM, that's okay, but you need to learn how to coordinate people that do, because it's intricate to how we manage our projects. So at the same time, don't feel pressured to learn it, but at the same time, feel pressured to understand it. At the same time as well, you can always just try programs if you're not sure. Most of the programs I've showed you have free trial versions that you can actually just get a hold of and just try out the program. And feel free to check out my channel where I demonstrate these programs as well. But yeah, that's some of the advice that I tend to give on what you should learn. Standards are something that's really important to BIM as well. This is sort of the industry's goal. So we want to have most of our standards be international or national. So international being ISO standards. And we want to minimize how many standards are specific to a company, because these are obviously very, they're not shared around with anyone, so they don't really add any productivity to the industry. They just add it to a single company. The reality is it's more like this at the moment, unfortunately. Companies are still really mostly standardizing themselves internally. A lot of companies think that their value comes from how particular their system is, and a lot of the time that's not true. Say they might really be proud of their drawing numbering system, but at the end of the day, most of their profit doesn't come from that numbering system or even any of the efficiency it gives them. So it's funny to see that companies are still very protective of their standards, and sometimes I've met companies that are very protective of their standards, and the standards are terrible. So it's not always the best way to focus on standardizing what you do with BIM. As well as that, local can be good if it's necessary. So if you've got like a council, for example, then local is very important. If local is just a bunch of people that get together and decide to do something a particular way, maybe it's important, maybe it's not. Whereas national and international are really important because they mean that we can work together in particular ways. And I think what we've seen in this remote working time is that we have the opportunity to work in many places at once. So we might find that we're going to be working on more projects internationally with people now because we realize we can. So I think it's important just to expect that this will eventually flip back into this. So definitely learn more about national and international standards where you can. Like I said, company standards, if you will come across them in your career, there's no avoiding them, and that's okay. So companies need their own standards sometimes. Each company is going to be slightly different, so I can't really tell you what the company standards are going to be like. Expect them to relate to things like naming conventions and file systems. The AEC industry is quite obsessive over naming and filing and what things should be called. It's very common. Expect them mostly to relate to how they manage their data. So this could be the common data environment, such as a hosting platform as Aconex or a web server, where all the data is stored for their projects, because cloud is becoming much more common. But expect that you'll see a lot of what we call legacy, so how things have been done. Companies are usually very slow to change because change costs money. Not changing also costs money in the long term. So some companies aren't changing enough. Some companies are scared to change, and some companies are changing. So just expect to see that at the company level when you join the industry. Locally, this relates more to your council. So this will be things like planning guidelines, development plans, environmental plans, and approval regulations, so like development application procedures. Some of these relate to BIM, some of them don't, and some of them should, but they don't. For example, a lot of the environmental plans don't actually specify any BIM testing methods that should be applied, such as that they'll ask for you to prove something, but they won't tell you how to prove it. I think this is a change we need. If someone's asking you to prove that, say, your living room receives more than 2 hours of sun on a particular day of the year, you can only gain value out of telling people that you should use this program in this way to do it, or even better, give them access to that program and tell them how it should be done. I think there's a lot of change required in this aspect, because at the end of the day, it's in the council's best interest to have designs measured and tested in the proper way. Otherwise, people do tend to pretend that they've done it and not actually do it properly. So this can be really important. At a national level, this relates to your government or nationally recognized organizations. This can relate to building codes, for example, so your construction code. But it's important to note that in most countries, BIM is not legally required. Some projects and some clients might ask for BIM or require BIM in the tendering process. But at the same time, it's not that common. There are only some countries in the world that have forced BIM all around. And one of these is the UK, or the United Kingdom. So Britain, Ireland, I think Scotland as well. Got to brush up on my geography. But they had their own BIM standards for a while, the UK standards, or BS 1192. And now these have evolved to become an international standard, or ISO 19650. So they've had a really big impact on BIM and its requirements that we're starting to see. I guess as well as that, you've obviously got like a construction code. So you've got the NBC, or the National Building Code, that you have to follow as architects. And this can relate to BIM as well, because you can use your model to validate the criteria for this construction code, which is really important. And I guess construction codes do change. They change slowly, but sometimes they can change fast. For example, in London in 2017, you might be aware that there was a really bad fire. A product was not sufficient and flames spread across the entire facade, and there was loss of life. This is, I think, the Grenfell Tower. And I think as a result, everyone around the world revisited their construction code because they realized that the combustibility requirements weren't sufficient. So we can see things change quite quickly when disaster is the motivator. And even I did some research and found out you had a pretty big disaster in Nigeria recently as well, where a building had a fire and the structure collapsed. It wasn't integral. So this will influence your codes as well. BIM doesn't get as impacted by these things, unfortunately, but I guess if they were more tied together by international standards, we would see more change. But internationally, it's very slow to develop. Because everyone has to agree. You have to get people from all around the world to come together and put their stamp of approval on the ISO in order for it to be accepted. And building codes usually are national, usually not international. So it's really important as architects, even just putting BIM to the side, it's really important to make sure that when you work on a project and you're working to a construction code, or you're specifying a product, you need to make sure that the compliance testing relates to your specific standard. So if you've got a firewall, for example, you need to make sure it's been tested in your country to the country's building code, even if it has an international certification that accepts it. I think it's really important just to remind graduates that how important that is. As well as that, BIM has an international standard, ISO 19650, which mostly deals with how to manage data and assets in a big team using BIM. So it won't tell you how to model in Revit, for example, but it does tell you how data should be handled on a project, which can relate back to our software. As well as that, we have an IFC file format, or Industry Foundation Class. This was a schema developed a while ago in response to the fact that we have a lot of programs generating a lot of different file types, and all these file types aren't compatible. So I can't open an ArchiCAD model in Revit, and I can't open a Revit model in ArchiCAD, just like I can't open a PowerPoint presentation in Notepad. Well, I can, but it's not the right program to do it in, that example. It's sort of like putting a PlayStation disc in your Nintendo 64. It's not going to work. So they sort of got together and said, we need a file format that can be read by all programs, and all programs should be changed to write these files as well. And IFC was the result. It's still developing, but it's one to be aware of. And ISO 19650 is definitely something that all people passionate about BIM need to familiarize themselves with. And as well as that, who to watch. I think it's really important to be aware of the organizations that are impacting change. Two of the biggest ones right now that are really impacting BIM and how it's relating to our specifications and our standards are Building Smart International, or BSI, and also NBS. So definitely check out what they're doing if you're interested in finding out more about this. I'm going to talk about careers now. So I'm going to focus on my journey, just briefly go through all the steps that led me to where I am today, the challenges that I faced and the challenges you might face or probably will face, and just give you some advice on how you can tackle those challenges, and also just some career pathways that might assist you in finding out how you want to travel through your career. So this is me. This is me back when I graduated from university in 2012. So I began my studies in 2007. I just did 5 years of studies, did my bachelor's, did my master's. Came out in 2012. While I was at university, I almost knew nothing about BIM. BIM was just becoming a really popular thing around then, but the universities weren't really teaching it yet. They were still quite old-fashioned in what they taught us. So I mostly used AutoCAD and 3ds Max, which aren't BIM programs. So I came out with the skills to be an architect, but not really the skills to be a BIM user. This is me in my early career. When I first started, I applied to about 50 firms, and I only heard back from one. So if you ever have trouble finding a job, just remember it probably happens to most of us. It will take time. It can take up to half a year or more to find that first job. We're in a very competitive marketplace, but the important part is not to give up. Never lose hope that you will find that job. And once you find that first job, it's such a big leg up in the industry. Like once you've got that first job on your CV, it opens doors for you. It's so easy to find work once you have just a little bit of experience on your CV or resume. So never give up. And I guess I found the lead through a friend. So the value of networking is really important. So make sure that you grow your personal and professional network as early as possible. So I had my first job in April 2012, and I'd never actually used Revit before, and the project was all in Revit. They actually tested me for Revit when I first started, and I failed the test. So, the Aussie BIM Guru wasn't always a BIM guru. Once upon a time, I was a graduate coming in fresh with no idea what I was doing. So, yeah, we all start somewhere. And I guess luckily they gave me a chance, and this helped me continue. So this is my first project. I was really lucky to start on a major project using BIM. If you ever get the chance to work on a large project in BIM, even if you're a graduate, just try, because it will elevate your career to another level. You don't get stuck on little small projects. You just go straight in the big one, and you'll get so much experience. So I worked on a $2 billion hospital. Yep, not 2 million, 2 billion. So it was a big project. It was the largest BIM project in the Southern Hemisphere at the time, and it's still one of them. It's a pretty major project for my hometown. And there was about 80 plus architects, and then there was probably about that many engineers, and then probably maybe 3 times that many people on site throughout the project. So it was massive. There was 2 clients working together, the state and a construction body. So it was major. So BIM was crucial to how we delivered this project. During my journey, I sort of followed this progression of roles. So I'll sort of explain how I moved through these roles. But I started off as what we call a technician. So the concept of a drafter is not really as common now. Usually we call it a BIM technician, or a Revit technician, or a model technician, or a Revit architect. Essentially, you're working with the model to generate technical outcomes. So you'll typically be doing things like basic design exercises, very basic planning. I find usually because a lot of the architects don't use BIM, they try to take on most of the design challenges themselves. So you may not see as much design as you hope to begin with, but just get as much experience as you can. There'll be a lot of documentation for most of us when we first begin. Expect about probably 75% of your time to be modeling and documentation. And that's okay, because you learn a lot about construction through the art of documentation, and you'll learn a lot more just about how a building goes together as well. There might be a bit of auditing and cleaning up. So a lot of the time our BIM models, they get really slow, too many things are in them that shouldn't be in them. Someone's dumped in a AutoCAD file, someone has to go in and clean it up. So usually we'll have specific people delegated towards cleaning up the model every now and then, which is one thing that I did when I was early in my career as well. And it was actually a really good thing. So it taught me about the quality of good modeling and clean modeling, and how you can actually speed up your models, save time, and make everyone happier through working in a fast model. As well as that, you might be doing a little bit of what we call content management. So this could be managing the objects on the project, because we're working in 3D now, so everything is much more important. You need a chair to look like a chair. It's no longer just a set of lines. So people have to go and actually build these objects or clean these objects up. That was a big part of my role. And maybe some basic coordination if you're lucky. I was quite fortunate to be given some coordination tasks, so actually working with engineers and resolving issues with them. Say like, I need a mechanical duct in this room, but there's no ceiling. Obviously the solution is put in a ceiling, but it was more involved than that. It was like, can we actually afford a ceiling in this room? Or maybe, why isn't there a ceiling? Maybe they've made a mistake. So that basic level of coordination. But I guess during this time, I did one thing that I encourage everyone to do as early as possible, and that's to self-educate. So find the programs that you're passionate about, or find the techniques you're passionate about. Maybe you're not a BIM user, maybe you're an architect. Maybe you want to learn more about construction. Start researching details. For me, it was to research Revit. That was my big thing. I wanted to learn everything about this program because I knew I wanted to be a BIM manager very early. I loved what this program could do, and I wanted to manage teams that were using this program. So every night for about 3 months, I learned Revit. I wanted to learn a lot more about the program, how it works, how it can be set up. And I guess projects didn't always teach me everything that I needed to know, because projects are all different. They don't explore every aspect of a piece of software, because a piece of software is built to handle a lot of different things. So if you're putting together a library, for example, you're not going to see the same things that you'd see if you were doing, say, a commercial building. For example, in a commercial building, we almost never model any furniture because there's no fit out. That you need your tenants to fit out the building. Whereas on a library, obviously the furniture is much more important. So you might not learn how to build content in a commercial project the same way you would on a library. The same as working on a hospital, I didn't learn everything about Revit. So I actually just remotely accessed my machine from time to time to learn this program, and I learned everything that I could about it. So this really boosted my career. It actually caused me to sort of leapfrog over a role in my journey, which is a BIM coordinator. I sort of skipped that role because I learnt the program so fast and it was so in demand. I managed to, I guess, get the attention of an office that wanted to elevate me up to a BIM manager. And I was very young. I was only 25 at the time. But I guess I saw the opportunity and I took it. And it was the right choice at the time, but there were some challenges involved. So I think my lesson I learnt here is that you don't want to move too fast. It's tempting to go for the big roles as fast as possible, but you will miss out on things along the way if you skip certain roles. So as a BIM manager, I moved to Sydney and I started developing all their templates, their library of objects. I started training their company because obviously my skills in Revit were at a different level to most people there. So I needed to elevate their skills as well. And then sort of got more involved with setting up projects and also working a little bit on BIM projects as well. So it was a big change. But like I said, my lesson was that I sort of skipped the role. I didn't really learn how to coordinate on projects. I didn't really do a lot of project work until then. I'd only worked on a couple of different projects. And a BIM manager needs to understand a lot of different types of projects because there's essentially just one BIM manager in most companies, but there's a lot of different types of projects. So again, just try not to rush. Plan out your career journey carefully because you don't want to skip crucial roles in your journey. I think BIM managers, they always need project and discipline experience. So if your goal is to be like an architectural BIM manager, make sure that you understand architecture, not just BIM, because this will make you more relatable to your peers, and it means that the solutions you give to problems your peers have are more suitable to what they do. As well as that, I think it builds respect. People will respect you more if they know that you've got the background and the experience. As well as that, just coordination and construction knowledge is really important to have. So if you get a chance to go out on site, always take that opportunity because sometimes you won't always get those chances. And you learn so much from seeing the real world and how people actually build a project versus just modeling it. So I actually went back. I hung up my towel as a BIM manager. I quit. And I moved on to another company and I became a BIM coordinator. So technically this is like a step down. But in terms of my experience, it was a step up. So it can be hard to take a step down in a career, but you might find yourself having to do it one day. You might find out that you need more experience in a particular role and you have to go back a step. So I did that. I learned more about leading a team. So I had a smaller team to manage in each project I worked on, and I worked with BIM managers instead. But it gave me time to learn about coordination, construction, how projects go together, and communication as well, how I can work with engineers and other people. So this is one of the projects I worked on. It was a 25-story commercial tower in Melbourne. I also worked on another smaller hospital as well, which was a really interesting opportunity because on my first project on a hospital, I was one of 80 people, so I didn't really matter that much in the bigger picture. But on this project, there was 6 of us. So suddenly I had a lot more control and I was much more involved in the project. I worked on both projects for 1.5 years for 2 different companies, but I learned a lot about construction, services, coordination, etc. This is actually the Navisworks of that model. Essentially, just you can see it paralleled there. So it was a very advanced and detailed model. We used the Revit model for production of drawings, but we coordinated it using Navisworks. So it taught me more about the value of the BIM model and what we can do with it. And I learned a little bit more about the IFC format during this time as well. So it taught me a little bit more about the power of good data so that you can set up other types of models that can process that data. And I learned about just the importance of the management of this data. This is the hospital that I worked on. So it was an upgrade to an inpatient unit. And this is an example. So that the coordination example I showed you before is from this project. But I also learned more about advanced content creation in Revit. So I'm actually really passionate about the creation of good quality and fit for purpose BIM content. You can see here's a facade hood system that I designed using a more advanced technique in Revit. And this could be adapted to suit every single facade hood on the entire project. So it saved the team a lot of time in the long run. But this is me now. So I actually went back to BIM management for a little while. And I launched my YouTube channel whilst I was a BIM manager again because I really felt passionate about giving back to the industry. But I realized that partway through, I wanted to help more people. Working for a company can be a little bit restrictive because you're only really able to help the people that you work directly with. So if someone from the other side of the world comes to me and says, hey, like, do you do consulting work? I'd love for you to help me on a project. I have to say, no, I'm sorry, I can't, because I have a contract, and if I do it, I'm breaching my contract. But now as a consultant, obviously I can help far more people. I can also share a lot more on my channel as well because I'm no longer locked into intellectual property agreements. So I can show you workflows that I couldn't show you before when I worked for companies that were building their own confidential workflows. So yeah, it changed how I get to approach the industry. And I'm getting a lot more involved in the global BIM community as well. One of the great things is social media connects us all now. And if you use it properly, you can get a lot of value from your network. So this was me going back to BIM management before, working on more projects. But one thing that really changed what I did with BIM is I started to explore what's called computational design. So applying coding to what I did. This has really changed my focus on what I promote in the industry. So I'm much more enthusiastic about programs like Dynamo, for example. And I'll touch on this a little bit later. I also learned a bit more about virtual reality and augmented reality and what it can do for our projects. So definitely check out what's going on in VR right now because that sector is still developing, but it's developing very fast. This is an example of just one of the models that I worked on. This is actually the office I worked in. We actually modeled the office up in Revit and used it as a test for Enscape. So you can see the Revit model up in the top left, and as you go down to the bottom right, this is actually coming out of Enscape for Revit. So this isn't a photo, this is a real model. So it turned out really well. It was a good way to test just how much we can get out of our BIM model from a visual perspective. But also I learned a lot more about regulation. So you can see here, for example, this is a disabled toilet, and disabled toilets, if people haven't done anything with them before in architecture, they contain a lot of standards you have to meet, and most of them relate to clearances. So you have to have a certain distance away from toilets and basins and showers, and I actually integrated these clearance zones into these elements. And what we could do with these is actually clash detect them in Navisworks. So you could go and automatically just detect any non-compliant bathrooms in your project, rather than going in and visually looking at them and needing to understand the standard down to the millimeter. So it taught me more about the value of taking advantage of data and understanding fit-for-purpose content that can really help users more than just a 3D toilet can. I also learned more about computation. So you can see here an example of a cityscape, and we needed to analyze the impact that a building had on the urban fabric around it. In this case, we generated a little diagram, and then we generated one after to show the number of grids in the hemisphere that the building was blocking. And this enabled us to go back to our client and tell them the impact our building was adding to the urban fabric. But yeah, I moved on to be a BIM specialist. This is the latest step in my career journey. I really did enjoy being a BIM manager. That's one thing I do have to stress. A lot of people assume that I just quit from being frustrated with the industry, and it's definitely not the case. I actually was very, very happy as a BIM manager, but I just wanted to help more people. I felt obligated to share my knowledge with more people through a business instead of just a YouTube channel. And I'm so glad I did it. But yeah, like I said, being at one company can be a challenge. So if you're ever at a company and you feel like you need to do more with what you do, consider opening a business. So some challenges that I faced in my career at the time. One thing was that learning resources were hard to find. Not only free ones or paid ones, just in general. There wasn't really as many resources around at the time. So a lot of my learning I did myself on my own at home, in my room with my computer. And nowadays, luckily, that's not the case. There's a lot of things out there. I always had to play catch up as well because the industry moves quickly, very quickly. If you are moving into BIM, just be aware that you'll have to learn a lot because we've come a long way. So every time someone joins BIM, they essentially have to catch up to the pack. So expect that if you're jumping in BIM now, you're probably going to be playing catch up for about maybe 3 years at least before you really understand how BIM can really work on projects. So you will have to have patience with that. But even I was playing catch up as well, and I still am. I haven't caught up to the industry yet. I'm still behind a few things. Like I'm just learning how to write C# programming, for example. Whereas some people were doing that 5 or 6 years ago at least that I know. As well as that, mentors were really hard to find. I wish that I had someone that was doing what I did back when I was doing what I did that I found. There probably were people like that, but I guess platforms like YouTube and LinkedIn weren't as well used. So you didn't have the ability to find them so easily. People typically found personal mentors instead. So people that they worked alongside that helped them. And I had a few personal mentors, but I would have really liked a few digital or online mentors as well that gave me a bigger perspective than just the company I worked in. As well as that, not all architects cared about BIM, and they still don't. And that's okay, you don't have to care about BIM, but like I said, I think all architects should understand BIM, because BIM users understand architecture. It's only fair that everyone works together and respects each other. But you will come across architects and engineers and builders and clients who think that BIM is a waste of time, or we should just go back to drawing on the drawing board and just do things the way it works for them. And you will come across that. So it will be a challenge in your career. And you will need to learn how to negotiate and talk to people in a way that doesn't make them feel lesser for not using BIM. It's a real challenge. Some good news for you. Like I said, there's a lot of learning resources out there, and a lot of them are free. For example, my YouTube channel, it's all free, no ads, no monetization. Some courses are paid and worth paying for, but it just depends on what you're looking for. Another great thing as well is software is far more developed and far more efficient than it would have been, say, 10 years ago. So some of the programs will have so many more features than they would have had 10 years back. Some programs didn't exist 10 years ago. So like a lot of the visualization tools I was showing you only came about in maybe the last 5 years. So as time moves forward, things only get better. There's also a lot of mentors available in the industry, and there are a lot more available because of digital media. So like, for example, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Gmail and Twitter and YouTube. I respond to nearly everything. I try to. Unless someone's rude, I'll typically respond to them and try to help them at least for a little bit of my time. And having those people can be really valuable because they can really connect you to the right answer a lot faster. But not only the right answer, but an answer that suits you personally. So if anyone ever is looking for advice, feel free to contact me. But make sure that the way you ask me your question gives me enough information that I can help you, not just help some random person. It needs to be in context of what you want to get out of having help. That's really important. So don't come to me and just say, I want to learn Dynamo. Come to me and say, I like to learn Dynamo and this is why I want to learn it. Where would you suggest I begin? So it gives me context about who you are and what you want to learn. But I guess, social media has connected us more than ever before. Some challenges that you'll face that I didn't really face as much. Like I said, the point of entry to the industry is higher than it used to be. You need to know more skills. There's probably less jobs for the number of graduates we have. But if you have the right number of skills and the right attitude, you will find a job. As well as that, competition is higher. There are more people jumping between companies, not only just coming in from a graduate level. And obviously the number of jobs isn't increasing at the same rate as the number of graduates coming out of university. So I guess we only have to do the maths to know that it is harder to find work. But it's possible. So like I said, just retain a positive attitude. That's the important part, and that will get you through. As well as that, obviously wages. There's something that most people don't discuss, but I will say that wages are not going up at the same as our cost of living. Architectural salaries are okay. They're not bad. But we're not lawyers. Like, we're not getting paid that high. So just be ready that you might have to, live, more carefully than, say, someone working in the medical profession. Because at the end of the day, we love what we do. We don't do it just to get paid. Architecture and engineering and construction, they're fields of passion. We're very passionate about what we do. So if we're here for the money, like, it's not going to work out. So if you're doing this for the money, yeah, bad news for you. But at the same time, you can make good money, especially in BIM as well, because BIM is in demand. So you can actually get quite good salaries. As well as that, pathways in the AEC industry, they're not always clear, especially in BIM. BIM is a challenging field to find your path, because there's so many ways to approach a problem in BIM. And there's so many ways that roles are told to face problems. And like I said, mentors aren't always easy to find. It depends on what you're doing. In BIM, they probably are most of the time now, but you may find your pathway is hard to determine. You might not know what the next step in your career is, so always think about that. And I guess too, there's a lot of programs to pick from, so just take on some of the advice I gave you earlier about being interested in your program, picking the programs that you need, and I guess just picking the programs that interest you and that you enjoy. So my advice based on this, firstly, is to self-educate. Make sure that you keep your skills up to date, or as up to date as possible. Try to be ahead of the pack, because you will find better jobs and more work if you do that. Focus on the value of the education that you receive. Don't focus as much on getting a certificate, for example. I've never, ever hired someone based on the certificates they have, except for their 2 degrees maybe. That's probably the only certificates that you really need on a CV these days. It's more about the skills that you receive through that training that are really important to the industry. So make sure that if you apply for a job, you articulate yourself to point out that these are skills you have, not just here's 5 certificates and I'll leave it up to the person doing the interview to guess what they mean. Because remember that people reading in CVs might not even know what those skills mean sometimes. For example, if you've done a program in C#, the HR manager probably doesn't know what C# is. If you say in your CV, I'm skilled in programming and computational design, they go, ooh, I know those words. It's all about articulating your skills. I think that's really important. As well as that, make sure everything you learn has context to what you do. So make sure when you go to learn a new program, try to give yourself a project or a challenge that you want to solve personally. Don't just copy the tutorials and do it exactly the way they do it. Try to find a problem you need to solve that doesn't have a tutorial out there that you've found. The first thing that I learned in Dynamo, for example, there was no tutorial for it. But I took all the little skills that I learned and I applied them to that problem to solve it. And then when I solved my own problem, it was much more rewarding as a result. As well as that, try to learn about BIM, but focus on learning your discipline as well. As well as that, just be ready for challenge. It's not an easy industry to work in, I'll be honest. But it's very rewarding if you work at it the right way. Don't be afraid to ask for help from people around you or people online. It's a very helpful industry. When you ask someone a polite question, you'll get a good answer typically. And just remember, some teaching is worth paying for. Not all courses should be free. Some courses, some of the best courses aren't free. So if you do see a course and you know you need to gain a skill in it, and there it is, sometimes, spending money isn't the end of the world. I know that different countries, things are more expensive relatively. So at the same time, don't feel pressured to pay for courses. It's up to you. But typically they can accelerate your career a little bit. I'd say avoid like Udemy and Skillshare and those sort of platforms. Try to find things like LinkedIn Learning where it's more professional. I find that the quality there is typically higher. As well as that, just experiment. Give yourself time to play with tools and find them out without just using them on projects. And I guess the biggest piece of advice that I give people is to network. Grow your network, but don't just grow it randomly. Grow it with purpose. Find people like you that you want to become like or that you want to work with. Connect with them. Don't focus on the number of followers or the number of connections. Focus on the quality of connection. That's really important. Because at the end of the day, it's not a numbers game when it comes to connections these days. It's about the value of the network and what it means to you. There's a few pathways that are available. This is my pathway that I followed. It's quite typical for most BIM users to just go through these 3 steps, maybe not the 4th step. Some people just stop at BIM management and that's good enough for them. For me, I wanted to go that extra step. But I think the coordination role is critical. You do need that to really understand how to manage BIM on projects. This is a pathway that maybe an architect would follow. So if you don't want to become a BIM manager, that's okay. We don't need, thousands of BIM managers in a country. We only need typically 1 per company. So at the same time, be aware that you might begin in a BIM technician role. You might not start as an architect, which is a hard reality for a lot of architects to face. They get in the industry and the first thing they're told to do is open Revit and start documenting. I mean, that can be hard after going from university where you design your own projects. You are the architect. You go into a company, you're no longer the architect. Legally, you're not even allowed to call yourself an architect anyway. You've got to get registered first too. So it's a bit of a step down mentally, but just be ready for it. And I guess from there, usually you'll follow the project architect, senior architect, management pathway. And I guess it's important to learn to delegate to people. So learn about teamwork and also how to manage people. Manage them fairly, don't just boss people around. Work with them, reward them for good work. And try not to remain a technician for too long. I'd say maybe like a year. After that, try to move beyond that role. Otherwise, you might get stuck there. And engineers, it's a very similar path. The only difference is that engineering is still very focused on the idea of drafting. They do still typically have groups of drafters in a company. They just get given project work and then they're on one project one day, another project the next. It's not like they get sort of their home project to draft on. So you might find that if you're an engineer, it's a little bit different the way companies manage this relationship. But once you're out of that drafting technician role, it's a very similar pathway to an architect's. If you want to be a software developer, if you've seen what I'm telling you and you've said, hey, I just want to be a programmer now after this, the good news is it's possible. The bad news is that you probably still need to go through a similar pathway to me because you need to give what you do context. So if you're going to build programs for architects, you probably need to have been an architect or at least have a very good understanding of what architects do. You might want to consider going back and studying programming if you want to accelerate your understanding of coding and how you're going to apply it. But at the same time, it's possible to learn to program without going and studying it. For example, I know how to code in Python now, and I never went to university or did any computer science. But if I had, it probably would have sped it up quite a lot. But I guess once you're working, you don't have as much time to study. Which brings me to my final topic, which is just a really quick one, which is visual coding. So this is a new paradigm that's sort of impacting our industry quite a lot as of late. So what is visual coding? So I guess on the left, you've got a C# program being written. And to a person in architecture or engineering or construction, that probably doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's very confusing. There's a lot of things happening. But if you look on the right, this is a visual coding script. It's much easier to understand how data is moving through the script from left to right. You can visually see the connections between the data. It's much easier. I think in this case, this is from Unity, I believe, but I'll show you some other examples. So visual coding is essentially building a scripted workflow using building blocks, which we call nodes. And this allows you to automate simple processes, or it enables you to do complex data-driven processes, like very complicated facade-based divisions and exercises. It also enables what we call generative design, so taking a concept with various variables and parameters and flexing them and then culling out all the options that don't meet certain criteria. So we can generate a building option 5,000 times and then ask the computer to show us all the options to comply to a certain condition, and we can start filtering through all the possibilities for our project. Really powerful. It's definitely worth looking into, but I probably won't cover it here because it's quite complex. But this is a little bit like what a node or a building block does. You have an input or inputs, you have a function inside the block, and then you send out some more data on the other end. And sometimes that block might do something. It might impact the model. It might go and put a dimension on something, for example. And eventually you put them all together, you group them all together, and you get a script where everything works from left to right. This is a Dynamo script here, for example. This particular script, I think in this case, is finding out the shortest path on a roadmap. So it's a very particular script, but they can do some very useful things. So again, to reiterate, I typically use Dynamo, but sometimes I use Rhino and Grasshopper and Rhino inside. This is an example of a script and a user interface that I built that batch prints for me. I just tell the plugin what I want to print. There's a few free tools out now that can do this, so it's not that useful anymore. But at the time, it saved me a lot of time and a lot of money because I didn't have to buy any paid programs that could do this. And it just goes and prints every sheet on my model that I want. There's that duct placement support workflow that I was talking about before. I even built a shortest path generator and then just built a little Revit model, just Pac-Man, just to show the concept. But this can be used for fire escape, to find the shortest possible escape distance out of a building. As well as that, this is a generative design tool. This is what we call Project Refinery, which is coming in Autodesk 2021, so Revit 2021. And this is sort of an example of those options that you can visually start graphing and selecting from. So you can see just some power, especially for early stage feasibility planning. But some learning pathways, if you're interested in learning more about this, I actually have a presentation on the HexaBIM platform. Just reach out to me if you want to see it. But essentially it's a more in-depth version of what I'm saying here. But there's a lot of resources here. So there's a primer or a guide for both Dynamo and Grasshopper on the web. There's a series by a guy called David Rutten, who made a really great Grasshopper beginner series to get you started. Obviously my YouTube channel, but also DiRoots, they have a basics and now an advanced Dynamo course as well, which is quite good. And also just LinkedIn Learning. There's a lot of courses on LinkedIn Learning, and just experiment too, obviously. But I guess my parting words to you all from my presentation, go into the world as a graduate and be bold, be curious, be optimistic, and above all, be collaborative, work with other people. But that's the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm happy to take on any questions if anyone has them. I don't know if it's easiest to get them out of the chat or just probably I'll just check the chat to see if any have come in there. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope that was valuable.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gavin. I really appreciate you coming to this session.
Yeah.
Yeah, really. We have a lot of questions from the chat box. I'll write them down.
Excellent. I'll just try and find the chat box and just expand it. Okay, yeah, we've got quite a few.
Okay, someone asked between C# and Python, which is much more preferable?
It depends on what you do. For me, for example, I'm learning C# just so I understand the fundamentals of it, but I don't know how far I'll go with it. So the difference between them in Dynamo and Revit specifically is that Python allows us to call on the Revit API, which is essentially all the C# based commands, because Revit essentially is written in C# in the background. It's using the .NET framework, and it's got all these commands that are basically just being executed the whole time. And we can call on those commands using Python to tell Dynamo to use one of the commands from the Revit API, essentially. So it's sort of like putting Python on top of Dynamo, which is already on top of C# in Revit. So that's the main reason that I'd learn Python. But I think beyond that, learning C# is mainly if you want to build your own custom add-ins that are packaged to work directly with Revit, which will be much faster. But at the same time, you could also learn C# to develop your own custom Dynamo nodes, which are what we would call a zero-touch node, which means that everything is built natively in C# and then just compiled into a node in Dynamo. Whereas if you build it in Python, typically it's built in what we call a custom node, which users can open up and have a look at and do things to. I usually encourage people to work in Python before C#, because I think there's a lot of things in Python that will teach you more about data management in a simpler way. For example, list management, I think is much easier to understand in the context of Python, as well as things like for loops and if then else and error handling. I think it's much easier in Python. If you're interested in learning Python, I actually have a series on my YouTube channel that I finished about 2 weeks ago. And it goes from basics up till maybe some medium level functions to get you started. And from Monday, this coming Monday, I'm actually doing probably an 8 to 10 part series on the Revit API and Python for Dynamo. C Sharp, I'm probably a long way away from doing because I'm only just learning it myself. But yeah, I think that they're probably the main differences and reasons for learning them in Revit or Dynamo. And if it's for Rhino or Grasshopper, it's similar. So you can use C Sharp in Grasshopper to write your own tools and packages. And I think Python, you can write little blocks of Python in Grasshopper. But I think most people tend to end up writing in I think in C Sharp, but maybe Python as well. I'm not quite sure on that one. Yeah, so that's probably the main reasons I would say.
Okay, thank you.
That's good.
Yeah, we have another question here. Also, what IFC software can you recommend for civil and structural engineers, particularly for collaboration with Revit?
Yeah, sure. So civil and structural engineers, it really depends. I mean, you can just use Revit. That is one option. A lot of structural engineers use Revit. Some engineers use Tekla. That's really common. It's not really a collaborative software. It has plugins that work with Revit. Tekla is really popular for contractors and fabricators. So it's better at steel detailing. Like if you use Tekla, your contractors will love you because you'll be able to give them native files that work for them really easily. But I would say most structural engineers use Revit. And then for testing and balancing and analysis, they typically use third-party software. One that's becoming quite popular is a plugin called Karumba for Grasshopper. But I believe there's a lot of other tools like Sophistic and other ones they can use. For civil, I haven't seen as much of it lately, but I did used to see a program around quite a lot called 12D. That was quite popular for civil engineers, but it's more common these days to see them use AutoCAD Civil 3D, which does support 3D CAD modeling, which is quite handy. Some of them just go straight into Revit, and they almost work like a piping engineer would work in Revit, which can be okay, but I do think for civil, Revit's not quite ready to support what you need. So AutoCAD Civil 3D might be, the next best thing to use. And most of us, we use Navisworks to coordinate in the Revit environment, and AutoCAD Civil 3D we can use in Navisworks as well. And probably the final program that I've been seeing some civil engineers use is called InfraWorks, which is a program by Autodesk that lets you do high-level civil planning. So you can do like roads and bridges and things like that. But I'd say definitely if you're in civil or structural, have a look into Revit. It might suit you, it might not. And as well as that, if you're doing, say, bridge design, definitely check out Dynamo, because I think like bridge engineering, for example, as a wing of civil engineering or structural engineering, has a lot of gains to be made from computation, because you can really pre-program a lot of the variables in your bridge and the accuracy of placement of elements. So hopefully that gives you some options to think about.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, thank you.
Good.
Another question here is, please, how can we get exposure to all these software packages? He said some are looking new to them.
Yeah, there's some things on YouTube. I mean, most of these programs, they have a free trial version that you can download. I think Revit, like programs like Revit, all the Autodesk programs, I think they offer I think it's a 15-day trial. If you're a student, most of these programs, they can actually offer you a student license, which is free. So you definitely don't use it professionally or commercially, because if they find you, that they will make you pay for it, and probably a bit more. But definitely, if you're a student, they should offer you these. Definitely just reach out to their support team, and they should get back to you. If you want to learn Rhino, they offer a 90-day trial, which is really generous. So that gives you access to Grasshopper as well. Some programs I'm not sure about, like Tekla, for example. I don't know if they offer a trial. I'm guessing they probably do. Most programs offer trials. Yeah, most offer trials these days. I think if they don't offer trials, it's bad marketing. So yeah, I'd say that's the best way to learn. But as well as that, I would probably say, YouTube does have some tutorials. They vary in quality. Some of them, they might be like a bad quality instructor, or it might be a really old tutorial and the software's changed. But sometimes I go to YouTube to learn. I find that can be a nice way to find like a really informal lesson. They're probably the two avenues I use. I used to use LinkedIn Learning. I just found eventually I wasn't using it enough, so I wasn't getting my value for money out of it. But at the time, that was a really helpful resource. I think it's about $30 a month US. So I know it's a little bit expensive for some people. But maybe for like a month or two, it might be worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. I think it's directed at your YouTube channel. Any material or videos recommendations for someone trying to learn Revit and Dynamo? Yeah.
So I guess yeah, in terms of this is like in terms of YouTube or just in general.
In general, in general.
So outside YouTube, yeah, I'd say again, LinkedIn Learning is probably the best place to learn Revit. There's a guy called Paul Orban. Any course by him for Revit is quite good. I would say for Dynamo, like I said, DiRoots, they have a basics and an advanced course. I'm eventually going to be doing courses, probably in like a month or two, and I'll launch them on my LinkedIn. I'm still trying to figure out the pricing to make it accessible because I know that I have a lot of followers around the world, so I don't want to make it too expensive, but I've got to eat too, so I don't want to make it too cheap. Yeah, so there'll probably be some resources, but I think just get on LinkedIn, have a look around at what people are doing, grow your network, and you will start noticing people sharing things and sending links to things. If you want to learn Dynamo, two resources that are quite good are the Dynamo Primer, which is just like, it's like a Wikipedia for Dynamo. It sort of helps people get started and it covers all the functions more or less. And also maybe the Dynamo forums are good to go to when you need help. But don't go to the Dynamo forums and say, can someone teach me Dynamo? Because they won't. They're really just there to help solve problems. Don't go there as well and say, I need a script, can someone build it for me? Because they won't. So go there if you've built a script and you're having trouble with something and you just need a little bit of help. That's a good resource. And sometimes, I can help there as well. I find these days I don't have as much time to help with Dynamo scripts because they take quite a while to open and figure out. So usually I'll tend to give some tips and eventually I'll say, okay, off to the forums. I don't have enough time, sorry. Yeah, they're probably some options for you, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. We have what career advice can you give to the electrical engineers interested in BIM? What aspects is most suitable for him, and how far can he go in the industry?
So there was electrical, was it?
Yeah.
Electrical engineer. Okay. I think I guess my career pathway advice I gave before more or less is what I would say. So understand that you probably will start out as a technician or a drafter. You might not start out immediately as an engineer, but make sure when you start off in whatever role you do that you connect and talk to as many engineers as you can, because they will teach you a lot about the industry and what to expect, and they'll teach you about the standards, because electrical engineering has a lot of standards involved with it, like cable separation rules and things that you'll need to learn quite quickly. I think in terms of probably learning more, that take advantage of the people around you. I'm not an engineer myself, so I'm not 100% on top of the best things to do. Revit is quite good with electrical engineering. There are quite a lot of tools that work quite well, particularly the cable tray tools. They do pretty much what you would need for most cable runs. When it comes to really detailed and system modeling, maybe it might be a challenge, but most, if not all, electrical engineers I know use Revit. And that means they can work more efficiently with their architects as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
That's good.
Trying to work on some structural elements optimization for a building construction. Is Dynamo a good software to handle this?
So this is there was optimization for units.
Yeah.
I guess if you mean like the layout of units, I'd say I wouldn't go trying to script an entire workflow yourself, because a lot of programs are coming out that are going to try and do this pretty soon. For example, Testfit that I showed earlier is an apartment layout algorithm tool. I think probably look into what they're doing. If you're trying to lay out like inside a unit, like a furniture layouts, maybe have a look into Grasshopper, and have a look into the Wallasai package and maybe the Galapagos package, which deal with generative and iterative design methods. Galapagos, for example, lets you set up a little study and collect all the data and measure the data, and then it keeps recycling the data, and it essentially makes what's called like a gene, and it keeps furthering the gene onwards and making it more refined. And you measure a condition, so you say, okay, maybe you're trying to optimize the location of a building on a site to get the best views. So you have to set up a script that measures that continuously. And then Galapagos, for example, keeps running that study over and over and over again, and it's randomizing all the inputs that you give it. So to begin with, the building just goes all over the site everywhere and starts measuring, but it gets closer and closer and says, okay, I can see the values between this and this don't work. And it starts refining it until at the end, it's almost just not even moving. So that's probably an avenue to look into if you're interested in like a simpler study. But if you're doing advanced studies, just definitely check out third-party tools, and I'd begin with Testfit. They have a free trial as well. It's okay.
So I actually have a question myself, but I think that will be at the end of this section.
Yeah, sure.
So, okay.
I think all the questions.
I think that's all we have for now. Okay, my question. When do you see BIM in the next, let's say, 10 years, and what do you think is the future of BIM?
Good question. It's hard. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have been wrong. It moves so quickly. I would say the future of BIM in 10 years is probably not Revit. I definitely think that program has a shelf life, and it looks like it's getting pretty close to it. So I'm pretty excited to see what the next big platform is and how it impacts what we do, because we are really dictated a lot by what our software can achieve. I think that international standards and collaboration are going to be much more important in 10 years. I think you're going to find people around the world can work on projects completely separate to them. There'll be a lot more specialists in BIM and a lot less generalists. So people that are a little bit good at everything versus people that are very good at one particular thing. So I think that's probably what we're going to see. It's sort of like if you look at like drafters now, for example. Most of the time you won't find that many drafters anymore because AutoCAD isn't as big now, so obviously every job that was supported by that program is no longer as relevant, but there are still a few, and when you find them, they're very specialized. They might be really good at doing facade details, for example. I think BIM's going to be very similar. You won't find someone that necessarily knows 20 programs and can be a BIM manager. Like, I think the BIM management role is not necessarily going to be the same in 10 years either. But I think it's definitely going to be dictated by not only the platforms and how they change, but also the way we work together. So yeah, I'm very excited to see what happens. And I think I've always said that whilst I love BIM, if you go back 30 years, no one was using BIM. If you go forward 30 years, probably no one will be using BIM too. It'll be something else. It'll be maybe we're all going to plug our brains into a computer or something like that, and we might no longer need any technical skills. It might be by the power of our creativity, and suddenly all these people that can't use BIM suddenly become more important than BIM users. The possibilities are endless. I mean, you might have seen that people like Elon Musk are trying to unlock the power of the brain, and I'm amazed by what they're trying to do, and sort of scared as well. But yeah, I think it's so hard to predict. Things are moving so fast, but at the same time, it might still be exactly the same. It all comes down to how creative and innovative people like us are, because we are the future essentially. Like, I mean, most of the graduates now are going to be the people that are solving a lot of the world's problems in 30 to 40 years, or maybe sooner than that. So I think it's really up to us to determine that future as well. So like I said, I think we all need to be really collaborative, talk to each other, be aware of what's happening, and we'll find that the future will be a better outcome as a result.
Okay. How about emerging technologies like generative design, AR and VR? So what do you think of those?
Yeah, I think that some of them are probably going to be more important than we realize, and some are going to be less important than we think. I think that VR and AR is probably going to be less important than we think. I think we've all started to realize in AEC that VR isn't that good, because when you put a VR headset on, you're no longer with anyone. You're away from the client, or you're away from the architect, and you're locked into a little environment. We've all moved on to the idea of AR, or augmented reality. So putting people in an environment together. I think that might have a future. It really depends on how much value we can get out of doing it. And that's the hard part. If you can't charge for it, there's no point in doing it, because we can't support the money to buy the software or to continue the project. So I think that's what it will come down to. If our clients can see a strong use case for AR, I think it will take off. I haven't seen industry-wide acceptance of AR yet. I think it might happen in maybe five years or so. It might be a more accepted technique. For now, it's more like it's like a trick or a gimmick for some people, and for some companies, it's really important to them. But no one else is doing it the way they're doing it. For example, there's some engineering firms like Oricon or Arup that are very well known for using AR on their projects to walk their client through the project and to run their coordination sessions. So they all get on site in their headset together, and they can all see each other as people working together and pointing at things, going, "Hey, what's that? What's this?" And they all sort of start working together. And the other one, so it was VR, AR, and generative design. Generative design, I think, will be extremely important, but I think we still don't really understand how to use it. I think we're still playing with it like a bit like a tool. Some people definitely understand the value of it, like Testfit, for example. They're using generative design in the background. They're running an algorithm that's probably finding the most efficient outcome when they generate their apartment layout. I think a lot of us are using it a bit like a toy still. We're just experimenting with an idea. Like, for example, if you use the generative design tool in Revit 2021, pretty much all the examples, they're almost useless on a real project. We'd never use them. So we still haven't really figured out, what it can do and how we can use it. But a few people have. Yeah. I'll just unmute myself. There we go. I'm back. So I think some companies have figured out how to make use of generative design. The really hard part with generative design is that you have to put a lot of work into this script that will build the outcome. It's not just pressing a button and watching some options pop up on the screen. Behind the scenes, there's a very complex algorithm usually generating that study. And every example is so different that you're almost always going to be writing your own script every time. So until we can mainstream generative design by someone writing the algorithms for us, for example, what Testfit's doing, I think it's going to be hard to see it really become fully used by the industry. But once third parties build their platforms that use generative design for us, we'll have more time available to use the platform. But for now, the time that it takes to set up those studies usually isn't worth a company's time to invest unless a client specifically pays and asks for it. But I think that there is potential for it in 5 to 10 years. I think that there'll be enough third party things for sure. Yeah.
Last question now.
Yeah, sure.
With regards to African students, what advice can you give them to actually make use of the potential we have? About the near future.
Just say again. Sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
Okay, taking the African student as a case study, Africa as a continent
Mm-hmm.
and Nigeria as a country.
Yep.
So we have so many students with great passion for things like what you do and taking you so seriously. I really appreciate everything you do for us.
Thank you.
So what advice can you probably give them to actually key their minds to upcoming innovational technologies like this and so many digital technologies around?
So how they can sort of do what I've done, or?
Not probably you, but take opportunities. Let them know that there are so many opportunities in what BIM provides and many more.
Sorry, just so you want me to tell them sort of about the opportunities available right now to them?
A great advice you could give them that will stick to them.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest piece of advice I give is that you have to collaborate and you have to be present. That's the biggest thing. You have to be. I mean, having a network is so valuable just to be aware, because if you're not aware of what's happening in the industry will move past you. So I think it's really important just to be mindful of what's happening. LinkedIn is one place you can be mindful. I use Twitter a lot as well. Obviously, building that network takes time, and that will take time. But take advantage of people like myself, and even like Adeju is in here as well, working at DiRoots. They can connect you with a lot of people. And keep an eye on these people too. Track what they're doing. Look at the programs they're using, because chances are they're probably ahead of the industry. I mean, a lot of what I do is ahead of what the industry is doing right now. And a lot of people, they do things that are ahead of me. So they're ahead. Like there's so many stages of being ahead of the industry. And I know in Nigeria, for example, like BIM's not necessarily being used that commonly at the moment. But even in Australia, like I would say, there's still companies not using BIM. So there's going to be certain stages of adoption, and it's up to you whether you want to join a company that is on that adoption cycle, or you want to focus on being an architect or an engineer, and maybe you'll come back to BIM later. But just remember that if you come back later, it's going to be ahead again. So being present and aware is really important, and I think just having your pathway in your mind as early as possible is really valuable, because it will give you that direction and that growth that you need to really get to where you want to be. Because I didn't figure out until quite recently what I really wanted to do. I always thought I was going to be a BIM manager. That was my job. I was going to live. I was going to die. A BIM manager. That's my job. And then one day I just went, you know what? I'm going to be a consultant. That's it. That's my pathway. I had an epiphany. I thought about it a bit harder than that. I didn't just quit one day. But yeah, I had to think hard about it, and I sort of contextualized everything I'd done during my career, and realized that that was the logical pathway I'd been following. But if you can think about your pathway earlier by being aware of what's happening in the industry and what you're happy about, what you find fun in, because you've got to enjoy your job. Like, I love my job. Like, I love using BIM. I love using software. Like, I showed you that video game model that I set up before. I mean, it's a project of passion a lot of the time. So I think, yeah, just make sure you're aware of your pathway and you're just aware of the industry. That's probably the biggest takeoff I would give graduates.
Okay, yeah. Then before we move on, this is the last question I also
sure.
Actually moved from being a BIM manager or BIM coordinator to setting up your own firm. And there's one thing really growing in Africa, which is entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
So what that decision from leaving your job to actually setting up your own firm? Then what advice could you give to upcoming entrepreneurs or?
Yeah, definitely. Entrepreneurship is definitely like a really fun path to take, but it's a really hard path to take too. First thing is be ready for it. If you want to be an entrepreneur, understand the experience that you have and the experience you lack. Because to start as an entrepreneur means that you begin with only what you know, not what you've done. I started as an entrepreneur, as a consultant with things that I'd done. So I'd worked in companies for 10 years. So I had that backing behind me already. So when I went to a client, I could tell them, I've done this before. It was my job. I had a marketing persona. I had my channel. So I had a lot behind what I was doing, which has really helped me put momentum behind my business. For example, like my business on LinkedIn's already got almost 2,000 followers and I didn't even try to market it. It's just having that momentum just gave it that. But other people I know, they start as a consultant and they've barely got 100 followers. No one's interested in what they're doing because they didn't have that journey that really led them to where they are. And like I said, context is really important. When you learn, when you work, you've got to have context behind what you've done, why you're doing what you're doing. So if you want to be an entrepreneur, just make sure you've got that baseline experience or at least understanding of what you're going to be doing. Because ultimately you'll have clients and you'll need to convince your clients that you're the right person for the job. I have to do that as well. Like I have to pitch to my clients when they come to me. I have to brief them back and give them a proposal. And sometimes they say, "Oh, tell me you're the right person for the job. Tell me why I should hire you." Some of them are quite aggressive. Yeah. So just have that behind what you do. As well as that, one of the biggest things I tell people is just have money, because setting up a business isn't cheap. I'm only really just starting to turn a profit now in my business after like 4 months. For a while, I was putting a lot of money in my business and I wasn't necessarily working with that many clients, usually by choice because I wanted to focus on my setup. But the whole time I'm bleeding money. So, having the finances is very important. Otherwise you'll think about money too much. If you don't have money to fall back on, you'll be freaking out about finances and you won't get to focus on developing your business. You almost have to forget about money for a while. Just set up your business, set up your marketing, set up your content, set up your client base. And then once that's all in place, you start making the good money. And that's only really just what I'm starting to see now. I've put a lot of work into my client base and I'm just starting to see like a regular pattern of clients coming through. But at the same time, like, don't let all of this scare you away. Like, I mean, if you're passionate and you care about what you do, there's nothing wrong with becoming a consultant or just becoming an entrepreneur. Like there's so much reward over owning a business and operating a business. Like it's really fun and like it gives you a lot of power. You feel very powerful over your life. I love having my own business. Just going to my website and looking on my website, and I'm on my website, just a picture of me, and I'm like, I'm proud. Like it's a nice feeling. So yeah, definitely. If you're thinking of being an entrepreneur and you've got that entrepreneur spirit, go for it. But just make sure you've got a little bit of experience or understanding. That's probably the most important things. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you all should check out his website, bimguru.com.au.
Oh, thank you.
His YouTube channel, Aussie BIM Guru.
Yeah. Keep an eye on my LinkedIn because I'll be releasing some courses eventually. But next week, at some point, I think I'll be releasing a Revit template, and it's either going to be heavily discounted, or it's going to be free for everyone, or it's going to be discounted and people can message me if they're a student, and if they can prove to me they're a student, I'll give them a free coupon. So it's going to be one of those three models. Either way, students will have free access. So yeah, that should help people find a little bit more out about Revit as well. And it's a strong template. It's built with the best practices that I've used. It doesn't have like all the content, like it won't have all the tables and chairs and everything like that, because I'm selling that separately. But it will have enough for you to do like a basic project in Revit to a high quality that we would do in the industry. Yeah. But feel free to check out my website, my YouTube channel, my LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me. I'm on Twitter as the BIM Guru for my tag. And if you ever need consulting help or advice or work, feel free to reach out. I don't typically work like for free or pro bono, so only if it's like going to be a project that you're willing to put money into. But at the same time, just you can informally reach out to me through my LinkedIn or through my Aussie BIM Guru YouTube channel or my aussiebimguru@gmail.com email, and I'll do my best to sort of give you guidance and advice.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I mean, I had a great time presenting, and it's great to see so many people turn out. It gives me a lot of hope for the future of BIM, and also BIM in Africa as well, because I know that BIM's really pushed in Africa for this past year or so. So I'm really excited by what I'm seeing, and I wish you all the best in your efforts, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Thank you very much. Ayode, did you have any thing or any contribution to make?
Oh yeah. Feel free to join in, Ayode. Yeah, he's muted at the moment. Probably muted by host, I think, or...
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Gavin, so much.
You're welcome.
For the lecture. Yeah, really enjoyed it. I just have a few things to say. I feel the future of BIM is automation, where most of the processes will be automated. My own perspective, though. And yeah, recently I've been getting a lot of messages and people concerning software development, software programming, and others in Africa. Yeah. So usually a lot of people feel like, oh, you want to become a software developer, you want to become this or that. You actually need this in BIM, because majorly in the industry, most of the people I've seen are people who have been BIM specialists, BIM managers, and migrated to become developers and programmers. So it's always good to have that knowledge.
And also just architecture and engineering, the discipline knowledge as well. Yeah.
So you want to become a developer, you have to have knowledge of most of these programs to a very good level. That's one of the challenges I'm facing, because my part is I want to become a full stack software engineer, but I still have to understand some programs and
yeah, you need to understand the APIs and the backends and everything. Yeah. Well, you probably understand the best of anyone just how hard it is to make programs work together in AEC. Yeah. It's great what you've done, and it's really exciting to see people like yourself getting involved in programming at such a young age, from an architectural or an engineering background. That's really amazing, and I really commend you for what you're doing, and highly encourage everyone to check out what Ayodeji's doing over at DiRoots, and yeah, very cool.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think it's interesting too, whilst you talk about automation, I think you're right, automation is very important. But at the same time, there's a certain aspect in architecture and engineering of retaining the human aspect as well. So even if you automate a process, still making sure that the way you automate it is built for humans. Because I do notice in programming, there's a tendency for programmers not really to program for people. They either program for themselves or for just a computer to do everything the way they want it to. But then when you go and look at the user interface, it's a mess. So it's really important. And that's one thing I like about DiRoots, that their plugins have very friendly interfaces. But I've used some other tools where I'm like, wow, this tool was built for someone who built the tool to run the tool. So yeah, really important to retain that aspect of humanization. And I don't think we'll ever remove architects from the equation. Like, I think they'll just, the tools will become a way to streamline the process and maybe automate the software aspects of what we do, but maybe not automate everything. Like, for example, you still got to sue an architect at the end of the day. You can't sue a machine. So it'll be interesting to see how it develops. So that's what I always say, as long as we can be sued, we're relevant. So, yeah. But it's interesting to see how the automation aspect will impact what we do.
Okay, I think we have a thank you message from someone here. He said,
Cool.
all students, participants from the University of Ilorin says our appreciation to the host and Gabby.
Oh, thank you, Bashir. That's really nice of you.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I've seen a few thank yous coming up, so I really appreciate you all coming along to this session. And you know, don't hesitate to reach out to me and other people. You know, be present in the industry, and it's great to see everyone turn out. And I know it's about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock over there, so it's good that you've taken the time out of your day to really, you know, come and see this. Yeah, thank you. Cool.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you. So, yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks very much. And I guess yeah, I'll talk to you, some of you later, and hopefully see some of you down the line.
Thank you very much, Gabby.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice day.
You too. Thank you.
Enjoy that.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
See you later, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.